Join me today as we discuss the 8th period of Bible history known as the period of the United Kingdom. Thank you for joining me today as we discuss this 8th period of Bible history known as the period of the United Kingdom. This follows exactly after our last period of the Judges leaves off. It is still in the time of Samuel is the judge at the time. He's acknowledged as being the last judge of those time. And this is at a time, you remember, where the people are in this cycle of sin where they did not follow God's law, and then he punishes them. They beg for deliverance, and God sends them a judge to deliver them. And then they, for time, are good, and the cycle repeats. Samuel is part of this time period, and at the end of this time period, when Samuel was getting older, he decided to make his two sons the next judges of Israel. And the people have a problem with that because they're not very trustworthy. They've seen how they act, they cheat people, and they don't want that. So they decide that they want Samuel to give them a king. You know, they're looking around at all the nations around them, and the reason for their oppression to begin with are all of these nations that they did not dispossess. You remember, God foretold that if they didn't go into the promised land and dispossess the people there, that these people would be thorns in their side. And this is exactly what has happened for centuries. But now they want a king like these people, and they think that's the answer to their problems. And then so Samuel mentions this to God. He prays about it, and God says, give the people what they want and warn them what the kings will be like. And he also consoles Samuel a little bit, and he says that, you know, they've not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. And God says, ever since I brought them out of Egypt, they've been rejecting me, serving other gods. So God really is just going to give them what they want at this point. So he tells Samuel to go ahead and give them a king. But then, like God told him to, he did warn them. And you can read about the warning. And we're going to talk about the specific Bible chapters and books here in just a minute. But just for this purpose, on setting this time period up, Samuel did warn the people. He told them that there will be kings who will rule over you. They'll take your sons and your daughters to work in the palace, and they said that he will take all, tax you a lot. So he gives them the warning, but really Samuel's just repeating something from Deuteronomy chapter 17, where God in Deuteronomy, Moses is warning the people, and he says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you and you possess it, this is Deuteronomy 17 verse 14 through 20. God says, you may set a king over you who I will choose, and it needs to be one of your brothers, an Israelite. But he gives some rules here. He says he must not acquire horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. He shouldn't acquire many wives for himself, lest he turn his heart away. He shouldn't acquire excessive silver and gold. And when he is on the throne, he should write for himself in a book a copy of this law, meaning the law of Moses, and it needs to be approved by the Levitical priest. And so I wanted to read those. It goes on. There's other things there. But I wanted to mention that because as we go forward in this time of history, especially even in this period of the United Kingdom, but especially later on in the next period of history, we're going to see that God's warnings here were explicitly coming true. He knew what would happen. He knew what was going to happen with these kings. And so many of their problems can go straight back to this very first idea to set a king up for themselves. We'll see kings who do exactly this. We'll see kings who not only don't follow God's law, but they won't even have a copy of God's law. And so it's just important. This is a good time period for good lessons to learn in this time period is, for one, always to trust God. We can believe if he says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And also, just to not rely on human help. Part of their problem is they're relying on human help for their deliverance out of this oppression that they're in from their own doing for not obeying God. And we know, and this is a good lesson in the whole scheme of redemption, that there is no worldly power, no worldly thing that's going to take care of the problem of our sin. And so I think those are some good lessons to remember before we go on. So now that we've talked about the narrative of this time period, let's talk about where it fits in to the Bible and history. Historically, this period is from about 1050 BC, 1050 BC, and it lasts for about 120 years, so it's not very long. And we can read about this time period in these books. Now, I will say this is one of the first. It gets a little confusing because so far, the Bible is not exactly chronological so far, but remember, I keep saying that the Bible is not written chronologically, and this is a good example. So this would be good if you actually have the book from Brother Kaiser, or to really refer to the worksheet, because I'm going to try to explain so we can all understand better exactly the books that cover this time period and how they kind of fit in. So you can read about this time period in the book of 1 Samuel. Around chapter 10 is where we start reading about Saul. And then the whole book of 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, chapter 1 through 11. And that is pretty much a straight narrative through there. But then we can read about this time period in the book of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9. Also, the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, and most of the Psalms were written during this time period. But let's talk about the Kings and the Chronicles books. The Kings, the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, that really just tells about the nations of Israel, and then what the time period we're talking about, and even like as they divide later, and it talks about their kings. It's like a history book, a narrative. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written for a different purpose. It was written later, for one, but also just written for a different purpose. It was written more to highlight David's kingdom and his descendants. And it was especially written after their captivity, which is going to come years later. But one of the main purposes of 1st and 2nd Chronicles was to give a record of David's throne and his descendants and his bloodline, because that is the time they're looking for the coming Messiah. They are faithful during that time. And so that's kind of the purpose of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But because it's about the same time period, you can also, it's going to be some of repetition. So when you start reading your Bible, you'll read a lot of the same things in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that you are reading in 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just written for a different purpose. So that's good to note as you study the Bible. Now, the name of this period of history, the United Kingdom period, is simply because at this time there is one kingdom. There will be a time where there's a divided kingdom, but overall, this is except for a small exception that we're going to discuss, this is a time of a kingdom, and there's just one, and they're united as a people. There are 3 kings who are the kings during this time period. And so the first one is Saul, and that's the king that God chose for them when they came to Samuel and asked for a king. And at first he was a pretty decent king. He fit the part. He looked like a good king. And he was at first, but he became very quickly to trust in himself more than he trusted in God. And so God told him, I'll take your kingdom away from you. And he anointed David to be the next king. Saul didn't like this. In fact, what we read about Saul mostly is his hatred and jealousy of David and how he chased him all over creation, tried to kill him several times. But we also see David's heart during all this time too, that he was not willing, even though Saul was very much mistreating him, he was not willing to revenge himself against Saul, because he said, "You're God's anointed." So David respected that about Saul. But eventually Saul dies, and for a brief time, some of the people in his army appoint his son Ishabeth to be the next king. But that's not who God chose. So God had already chosen David to be the next king. And there was a little time during this period where a lot of people were following Ishbosheth, and the house of Judah followed David. And that was the tribe he was from. So that makes sense. But eventually David's army killed Ishabeth, and all of the people followed David after that. David wasn't happy about that, but they kind of took matters into their own hands. And then this time of David's reign was considered the golden age of Israel. This is the king that they compared all the other kings to. In his kingdom, the glorious kingdom of David, is the kingdom that they have in mind when years later, when they ask Jesus, "Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" They are thinking about David's kingdom. So it just shows what a wonderful time period David's kingdom was. He was very faithful, very successful, and so that is important to remember. But then, of course, David dies, and his son Solomon becomes the king. And David had been told by God that Solomon would be the next king. In fact, this is a good example. If you will look at 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 9 and 10, it's a good example of what is called a double prophecy. It has a double fulfillment, because in this time, God tells David that he will give him a son. His name will be Solomon. He will be the next king. Verses 9 says, "I will give him peace and quiet to Israel in his days." He lists in my name. And then in verse 10, he says, "He shall build a house for my name." That's referencing the temple that Solomon will build. "And he also shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever." Well, this is obviously, Solomon won't live forever, but this is a messianic prophecy in anticipation of Jesus. And I want to mention this because Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, like David. They're in the same bloodline. And so that's how God can say, "You will have a king on the throne forever, David," because Jesus is the King of Kings. And we know that they are from the tribe of Judah. And Judah was Jacob's son, and who was Isaac's son, who was Abraham's son. And so this also goes way back to that promise that Abraham made, how all the nations will be blessed. It's because of Jesus through the line of Judah and David, and that we are blessed by Jesus. So it's a very important time in Bible history, so many things. It's a very interesting time to read about, so I hope you study. We're going to have some links about some archaeological studies about the authenticity of David's kingdom, which will be interesting, and a few other links. So I hope you check that out. Please like and share and subscribe. That really helps other people see it. And the next time we will be talking about the 9th period of history, the period of the divided kingdom.